All right, I think it's time. Welcome, everyone. I know people are joining us from South Korea today, as well as from Hong Kong and a few other places. So welcome, everyone, to the 2021 webinar series, Global Education Office webinar series, Understanding the Japanese Model of Education Through East Asian Dialogue. Welcome, everyone. So today, it has been customary for me to spend about 10 minutes trying to situate the talk within the broader theme of the webinar series. But today, as soon as I realize what the presenters are going to do today, when I look at the slides that they were going to use, I realized that these guys have spent a lot of time preparing for the talk. When I look at them, they were about 54 slides, and that's a lot of slides to go through in a presentation. So I'm going to keep this introduction as concise as possible so that these guys will have sufficient time to go over what they have prepared. So I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Chun Kim and Jung-Hoon Jung, two scholars from South Korea. Just to briefly introduce them, Chun Kim, Professor Chun Kim, he's a professor of the Department of Education at Chinju National University of Education, South Korea. He received his PhD from Ohio State. He has published more than 50 books and 80 articles in the area of curriculum studies, qualitative research, and post-colonial curriculum theory. He has won 6 national book awards, including from the Research Foundation of Korea and the Korean Department of Education and Culture. He co-founded the Korean Association for Qualitative Inquiry and its journal, the Journal of Qualitative Inquiry. He has served as a regional editor of Asia for the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, very well recognized journal in the field, and has taken a lead role in curriculum and education research in Korea. Welcome, Professor Kim. And another presenter, they're going to be co-presenting together today. Dr. Jung-Hoon Jung. I hope I'm pronouncing your name okay. So Jeonbuk earned his PhD from curriculum studies at the University of British Columbia, Canada, where I also did my master's long time ago. He is the, my understanding is that you are teaching at the Jeonbuk National University at the moment, right? Okay, yeah. So he's teaching at the Jeonbuk National University in South Korea. His research interests include curriculum theory, shadow education, which is the topic that they're going to be talking about today, and teacher education and post-colonial studies. Jeonbuk won an Outstanding Research Book Award for his co-authored book, Ugly Duckling, the first-year elementary school teachers' lives in Korea, 2006. His recent research has focused on the shadow education phenomena, which has been published quite internationally and widely. The reason why I came across these two speakers today is this book. It's called Theorizing Shadow Education and Academic Success in East Asia, Understanding the Meaning, Value, and Use of Shadow Education by East Asian Students. So today's talk is going to be joined by 2 other individuals who contribute to this edited volume. Their names are Kevin Whitehall Yun and Ryo Mizukura. So these 2 individuals will be part of the presentation today. So the talk they're going to give today is titled Worldwide Shadow Education Epidemic and World-Class Academic Success in East Asian Nations, Theorizing Learning Fever Beyond Public Schooling. So let's please join me to welcome Dr. Chun Kim and Jung-Hoon Jung. Over to you guys.
Thank you, Professor Keita Takayama. Hi, everyone. This is Professor Chun Kim from South Korea. It is my great honor to have this wonderful invited speech on my local shadow education to the studies to your institute, sponsored by the Kyoto University. Before the speech, I would like to thank three people. First, I would like to thank Professor Keita Takayama for his academic acknowledgement and recommendation of my and Professor Jung-Hoon Jung's local work to the Kyoto International Education Office. I believe that Professor Takayama is one of the leading researchers in beginning the era of post-colonial and post-oriental curriculum studies in East Asia. From that perspective, the Kyoto University will be the new leading education institute to push this idea to the forefront of the post-colonial educational research in East Asia. Second, I would like to thank Mr. Chi Takamatsu and Mrs. Reina Takayama. They were really kind and systematic in preparing for this great speech. Also, third, I would like to thank Ms. Yokota and Ms. Sakanaka for their simultaneous interpreter. I believe that their energy and effort will be great to make this presentation in English to be accessible to the scholars of the Japan without any errors to the with the Japanese language. Today, the presentation title is Worldwide Shadow Education Epidemic and World-Class Academic Success in East Asian Nations, Theorizing Learning Fever Beyond Public Schooling. I will introduce each beginning of the part session, and Professor Jung-Hoon Jung will explain each topic more specifically. Professor Jung-Hoon Jung recently was advanced to the research professor at the Busan National University, and congratulations. For your better understanding for the speech, I will read the table of content. The first part one is the introduction for provoking questions. I will read the title again, so you will find 4 interesting terms or the definitions. The first one is the shadow education. Second one is the worldwide shadow education epidemic. Third one is the world-class academic success in East Asian nations. First major interesting definition is learning fever. The Jung-Hoon will more specifically explain the meaning and the value of the terms. The part 2 is the historical review of shadow education phenomena. Jung-Hoon will explain how this local and cultural phenomena on educational culture has evolved from the East Asian countries like South Korea, China, and Japan to the Western Hemisphere. Now it is the worldwide epidemic. Part 3 is the shadow education as post-colonial East Asian discourse. I believe that this topic is closely related to the purpose and function of Kyoto University Global Education Office, because they emphasized trying to find the Japanese model of educational culture through the East Asian dialogue. And part 4 is the Kim and Jung's new effort for the shadow education study. I would like to ask to focus on the terms shadow education studies rather than shadow education practice or shadow education phenomena. I and Jung would like to establish this local and cultural practice for the academic success in East Asia as part of the new emerging educational studies like the educational administration or sociology of education or curriculum studies. Part 5, fortunately, we will introduce the case studies in East Asian nations. In relation to the Japan, Professor Ryo Michikura will explain the use of shadow education for their academic success in Japan society. The second guest speaker is Professor Kevin Wei Ho-Yang from Hong Kong. He also talked about the powerful and the use of shadow education for their school success and academic achievement in public schooling in Hong Kong societies. Part 6 is future studies and issues. This is kind of the concluding remarks. However, I and Jung-Hoon will hear about your suggestions, ideas, and questions on this topic, and would like to extend their ideas and suggestions as another background for the internationalization of this local educational culture for the future studies. Thank you. So next part 1 is the introduction, and Jung-Hoon will talk about 4 provoking questions. Thank you, Jung-Hoon.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to begin with the concept of shadow education. There has been, still is, a sharp distinction in academia as well as in the public space, public education and shadow education. Public education has been considered as a light education, as you can see in the Chinese characters, and normal education, centered education, whereas private supplementary tutoring and shadow education, something hidden, something extra, something inferior. Next slide, please. Stevenson and Baker defined the shadow education as a set of educational activities that occur outside formal schooling and are designed to enhance the student's formal school career. Not yet. The previous slide, please. This definition emphasizes that the foremost goal of a shadow education is to enhance students' learning and their achievement in public schooling. Next slide, please. Mark Bray uses the term shadow education system and private supplementary tutoring system, which means that it has become multi-systemized in recent years. The word shadow expresses the mimicry character of shadow education, as Mark Bray discussed the appropriateness of the word of shadow with 4 characteristics. First, private supplementary tutoring only exists because the mainstream education exists. Second, as the size and shape of the mainstream system changes, so do the size and shape of supplementary tutoring. Third, in almost all societies, much more public attention focuses on the mainstream than on its shadow. And the fourth, the features of the shadow system are much less distinct than those of the mainstream system. The term shadow education negatively frames it as a subordinate or inferior to public education, thus associating it with strongly the images such as false, wrong, dark, bad, and undesirable. We would like to invite you to think about the term of shadow education and its shadowy character from your lived experiences. There are various terminologies that refer to shadow education that are used by different scholars in different countries. The terms include private supplementary tutoring, cram schooling, private tuition and coaching, extra lessons. Many of you from Japan may be well familiar with Professor Kim.
When we designed the first front cover of our second book. We selected the red color for the image. Why did I and you to choose the red color for the ample expression of the content of the book? Please explain, Jung-Hoon.
We have intentionally chosen the color to express that shadow education has become much heated in many countries around the world, and it is rapidly spreading like a virus. During 20th century, shadow education has mostly been prevalent in East Asian countries. Yet for the past couple of years, couple of decades, it has expanded to many other countries. It is much visible in North America, Europe, many Nordic countries, South America, South Asia, and Africa. According to Steve Antridge, approximately 40% of 15-year-old students from 63 countries learn in shadow education space. This is why we use the word epidemic, because it has been rapidly spreading and exists almost everywhere around the world today. Next slide, please. East Asia, quoting Takayama, East Asia, quoting Takayama, is on the rise once again as a source of educational inspiration. After the last 3 rounds of PISA, where East Asian countries and cities get the top rankings. That is why we wanted to study shadow education and the students' learning culture in East Asian countries. As we will talk later today, our 2021 book contains ethnographic case studies from each Asian countries and the cities such as South Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan, because we wanted to know how those students from those countries learn in both public education and shadow education space. As you see on the table, East Asian countries are within the top 10 on PISA. Many studies in the West discuss the result within the public education system. Yet, we think that such understanding is pretty much limited, if not biased, because they do not take students learning in shadow education into consideration seriously. Gradually, more studies reports that there are positive effects on shadow education and students' academic success. The result has been reported in countries such as Japan, Ozaki, Vietnam, Deng, South Korea, Kim and Jung, and others, China, Jung, Taiwan, Guam, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Russia, and England, Germany, Sweden, Canada, even Finland. Hu, Fan, and Ding, for instance, reports that supplementary math tutoring has a significant positive effect on the math score of students in Shanghai, Hong Kong, Japan, and Korea. Also, Shin found a strong relationship between the participation in shadow education and math achievement among middle school students in Seoul. Next slide, please. Dr. Kim, 마이크 켜고.
Yes, the first main definition or terms for this presentation is the learning fever. In relation to the great consumption of shadowy education beyond the public schooling in East Asia, many Western scholars with the ethic perspective degraded and criticized the phenomena. And Michael says, after observing and researching that kind of trend in Korean education, use the term educational fever as kind of very oriental and very bad representation of East Asian education culture. However, I and Jung-Hoon, after doing more than 11 years of qualitative research on South Korean shadow education in East Asia, their interpretation of Korean student and East Asian student use of shadow education is very oriental and very colonial. So rather than using the Western term called education fever, I and Jung-Hoon create the new terms learning fever, which means East Asian student academic traits and academic nature as more active and more autonomous agency. So the Jung-Hoon will explain that definition more specifically. Please, Jung-Hoon.
Thanks. We defined learning fever as East Asian students' desire, efforts, attitude, and enthusiasm that is exercised out of schooling for their academic success. We coined the term because existing terminologies such as education fever is not specific enough to understand and explain East Asian students' academic success and their learning culture. While shadow education expresses the standpoint of parents, learning fever expresses students' standpoint. To make things worse, East Asian students have often described as obedient and passive learners, both in academia and public media. However, as we studied for a decade, we cannot agree with that negative representation of East Asian students. They are neither passive nor obedient. Instead, they are active, proactive, independent learning agent with a strong desire for learning with specific and ambitious goals. In this respect, the term learning fever provides another way of interpretation of East Asian students' learning and their desire for academic success from post-Oriental perspective. Next slide. We would like to show you how negatively has shadow education in East Asia been represented. It has been associated with education fever, exotic or secret ingredient of East Asian educational culture, detrimental to students' development, even child abuse, and antagonistic to public education. Are these the only ways to understand the phenomena? As we have discussed in the previous slide, shadow education is not Asian, exotic, Oriental phenomena anymore. It is a worldwide epidemic phenomena that deserves much more scholarly attention. In fact, as we have studied, many students in South Korea and in other countries get help and assistance from shadow education with their learning and academic success in public schooling. We believe that it is time to reevaluate and reimagine the meaning and use of shadow education differently, especially from the standpoint of students. Given the four provoking questions and issues, there are two key research themes that we are going to share today, and then we want to emphasize again here. Shadow education should be considered as a major component for academic success of East Asian students in public schooling. Also, shadow education should be a post-colonial topic for transnational educational inquiry because it represents the educational culture of East Asia, which is different from the West, especially from the Western progressive education philosophies.
Thank you, John. This is the beginning of the part 2. The title is the Histrical Review of Shadow Education Phenomena. As you know, that this shadow education has been researched and described for more than 2 decades. And most of the research was done by the Western scholar. However, I think that this is the cultural and local phenomena. And I think that the scholars in East Asia must study this area. So the part 2 is the really, really long literature. So that Jung-Hoon will succinctly and briefly summarize how this shadow education phenomena has been researched and framed as a topic. Thank you, Jung-Hoon.
The term of shadow education and private supplementary tutoring first appeared at the beginning of 1990s. Then in 1999, Mark Bray provided the characteristics of shadow education activities with three aspects: supplementariness, its privateness, and academic subject-orientedness. Chun Kim's study in 2016 was arguably the first longitudinal qualitative study on students' learning and development in schooling and shadow education in a country. Next slide, please. In 2017, a German scholar, Steve Antrich, he was going to come today. I'm not sure he's here, but he discussed the relation between shadow education and social inequalities as he advanced the educational inequality discourse into deeper level. 2019, we theorized the shadow curriculum as a new definition of a curriculum. We are going to talk about this later more today. In 2020, last year, European Journal of Education published a special issue on shadow education. Given the history and current academic advancement of shadow education research, we argued that shadow education has indeed become a legitimate educational and cultural research topic. Next slide, please. Let me talk about geographical description of shadow education research in the world. First, without a doubt, East Asian countries are the academic homeland for the topic. There are numerous research on shadow education from South Korea and Japan and China, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan. Until a decade ago, most shadow education research from the countries mainly focused on the participation rates of students and the negative consequences of shadow education on individuals, public schools, and families and societies, which is what Mark Bray calls backwash effect. Majority of the studies were quantitative ones. Some qualitative research has been conducted, but they were done from the ethic perspective without enough consideration of the insiders' perspectives. However, for the past decade, the policy of shadow education research in East Asia has been diversified. There are more research on how shadow education contributes to students' learning, academic success, maintaining psychological stability, and achieving students' goals. Many research reports that shadow education is not only effective for students' learning, but also their achievement and university admissions. There are also research on the lives and professional development and identity formation of shadow education educators. Kevin Young, who we have today, has studied on this topic. While the discourse of shadow education is diversifying, we believe that we need more research from different perspectives from diverse academic fields so that we may imagine better public education system and school instruction and evaluation. Next slide, please.
Thank you, John. A recent study about American education has shown us that middle class and upper class of the North Korean families are getting more and more using shadow education for their children's education. Please enjoy the drawings on the right side of the PPT. This is the short summary of my and Jung-Hoon's first image of New York City in 2 years ago. Jung-Hoon, please explain what happened to the street of the avenue of the New York City.
Well, yeah, 2 years ago, we went to New York for ARA and AACS, and we knew, shadow education institutes and companies exist in America and anywhere, but many areas. But actually, we saw those signs in person, and there are many signs of Kumon and Kaplan and Redpan. It's pretty popular in New York City, and so we thought that it was a little bit, unexpected moment for us to see as a shadow education researcher. Shadow education research is pretty much popular in North American countries too. In the US, the studies shows that many American high school students get help from SE with their SAT preparation. There are many commercial companies. In The Politics of American Education, Joel Spring wrote that human capital education policies motivate parents to use the shadow education systems to aid their children to achieve academic and economic success. Next slide, please. Jennifer Lee and Min Zhou published the Asian American Achievement Paradox in 2015. They wanted to know, they studied why much more East Asian immigrant students enter Ivy League universities than their counterparts. They acknowledged the contribution of shadow education for the academic success of East Asian American immigrant students in public schooling. Next slide, please. Canada is not different. I did my PhD program from 2010 to 2015. I saw with my eyes many private tutoring institutes in the downtown Vancouver, in other areas of Canada. Actually, Aurelian Davis reported that Shadow Education Institute became school-like institute. It was 2004. It has been growing ever since. Next slide, please. As we have said, the European Journal of Education published a special issue on SE. There are more and more research on shadow education from European countries. Excuse me. While shadow education in many countries in Europe focuses on remediation, there are more and more students and parents who seek for better learning opportunities in shadow education for acceleration. In fact, shadow education is also popular in Finland. In 2020, Jokila, Tatia, Kusunen from University of Turku and University of Helsinki published an article, Market-Making Practices of Private Tutoring in Finland. They found that shadow education is highly popular amongst students who prepare for highly competitive university programs, such as medicine, law, and education.
Thank you, Jung-Hoon. In relation to the expansion of the shadow education in England, I and Jung-Hoon would like to introduce John Jerim's recent report. John Jerim is the scholar of comparative education at University of London. His major lifetime question was, why the PISA higher rankings has been dominated by the 5 nations in East Asia, South Korea, Japan, China, Singapore, Hong Kong. Why is that? And his conclusion was that whether or not the curriculum, maybe educational culture. However, my impression about his conclusion was not clear and was not vivid. What does it mean by educational culture? Family culture or learning culture or the schooling culture? So I think that John Jerim, as an expert on this issue, was trying to find the answer, but it was not correct. So, however, his another report showed that, like the East Asian nations, England is severely experiencing shadow education for the college entrance. Thank you, Jung-Hoon.
Shadow education research is also increasing in African countries, South American countries, Australia and New Zealand, and South Asian countries. India is a country where shadow education has been much heated. In the 2020 article, is shadow education becoming the new normal? Shalini Punjabi states, quote, in India, the growth of shadow education is providing informal avenues through which the young garner knowledge and skills, close quote. He further argues, quote, research has shown that students find their coaching classes more relevant and worthwhile as compared to their schools, and perceive schools as academically irrelevant places, close quote. It was a shocking statement. Additionally, in his essay, Shadow Education Study from Bengal Area, Paramita titles his article, Students Follow the Private Tutors, Not the Teachers. There is inverted roles between the two spaces. This is something we teacher educators and teachers need to think of. Next slide, please. Yeah. Shadow education has been studied in the academic fields such as sociology, anthropology, comparative education, educational sciences, family studies, and economics. The research falsely include educational inequalities that shadow education exacerbates, the meaning of students' learning and their lives in shadow education, of course, participation rates, effectiveness of shadow education practices, as well as familial expenses and job opportunities that shadow education industries create.
Thank you, Jung-Hoon. The part 3 is shadow education as post-colonial East Asian discourse.
As Ashcroft, Griffith, and Tiffin discussed in the internationally well-known book, The Empire Writes Back, what those of us who work in the discursive terrain of post-colonial discourse really need are critical language, concepts, and theories that would provide us alternative epistemological and methodological perspectives and strategies. To build communities and academic spaces for such possibilities, not only shall existing epistemologies and methodologies of the West be questioned, but also new languages and perspectives be investigated and theorized amongst us. We need to show not only to those in the West, but also to ourselves that we are also capable of knowledge creation, not mere knowledge consumers. And we can chart new spaces for post-colonial and post-Oriental discourse. We agree with Takayama, the East Asian education shall be neither caricaturized nor scandalized. East Asian education needs to be re-evaluated and reinterpreted. In other words, it needs to be studied, being informed by the historical, cultural, political, and linguistic subtext, which is different from those of the West. About the epistemological domination of the West in the international academia, Paraskeva argues that it is epistemicide, which combines the two words epistemology and genocide. He argues that non-Western epistemological and methodological perspectives and approaches has been highly under-evaluated, if not disregarded. As Professor Spivak questioned, can the subaltern speak? She was not positive. But we believe that, yes, we can. It's our professional obligation to prove it. Next slide, please. Given the scholars' discussion on the need of epistemological and methodological challenges against those of the West, today, we would like to discuss in what ways then shadow education in East Asia shall be an important post-colonial research topic. First, shadow education in East Asia shall be considered as a cultural heritage that strongly expresses the indigenous educational practices and meanings. Second, we researchers strategically refuses the Western ethic interpretation about the shadow education in East Asia. In fact, shadow education in East Asia has mostly been evaluated from the Western educational philosophy. For instance, the progressive education promoted by John Dewey. Third, East Asian students' academic achievement and their success in public schooling should be studied and understood within the ecology of education in East Asia. We believe that without taking shadow education into consideration, East Asian students' academic achievement and their learning culture cannot be fully explained and understood. Fourth, shadow education in East Asia shall be a transnational research topic for educational sciences, as we have shown that shadow education is not East Asian exotic phenomenon anymore. Importantly, shadow education in East Asia can be internationalized as a new model of education, as Pasi Sahlberg internationalized Finnish education. These are our beliefs and motivation for our research on this important topic.
Thank you, Jung-Hoon. Part 4 is Kim and Jung's new efforts for the shadow education studies. After finishing my PhD program in curriculum studies and qualitative research from the Ohio State University in the USA, I decided to study Korean-owned educational phenomena by myself. And I thought that shadow education is really something Korean, the best East Asian educational phenomena. I have written many books and articles about shadow education phenomena in Korean language. However, I was really shocked by Western domination of this topic by the Western scholar. That is the reason why I decided to stop writing about this educational topic in Korean language. And instead, I decided to write about East Asian shadow education in English. As Foucault said, the metaphor, power and knowledge. If you cannot deliver your idea in English, your academic status and esteem does not exist. So that's the reason why request Jung-Hoon to participate in this local and lonely topic, which most of the Korean scholar refused, or that does not something academic. That does not belong to the Western US educational science. They did judge through their self-monitoring about what is the science, what is the normal definition of the doing educational research. This is the very lonely, but however, I had to write about East Asian educational culture called the shadow education in English to deliver my ideas, my interpretation. Why is this East Asian educational phenomena has been dominated and colonized by the Western scholars? I couldn't find any native educational research from East Asia to talk about this something really East Asia. That is the reason. And this is first introduction our local study in English. Thank Professor Keita Takayama. Thank you.
Professor Chun Kim's Shadow Education, the Curriculum and Culture of Schooling in South Korea is the first book that provides ethnographic, longitudinal, in-depth research on shadow education in the country. In the book, he discusses, based on years of qualitative research, which has been published into many books in Korean, that Korean public schooling is now on a precarious status, with while shadow education has been much used and trusted by many Korean students and their parents. Next slide, please. Many people and scholars around the world, like Barack Obama, who always admired Korean education, may think that the academic excellence Korean students can be attributed to the public education system, which is excellent, I think, school teachers and Confucian culture that value, that respect the value of learning. Yet, their achievement cannot be solely attributed to public education, Instead, shadow education does the key roles for students' achievement. South Korean students rank consistently at the top of international competitions in subjects such as mathematics and physics, in International Mathematics Olympiad, International Physics Olympiad. Many winners of the International Science Olympiad has received private supplementary tutoring. There are multiple surveys that show similar results about students' evaluation on school teachers and shadow education instructors. We might have some school teachers here today. I suggest you to think about this. Even the government-funded research titled The Learning Environment and Cultural Analysis of High School Students by Choi, 2009. The report found that Hagwon, the Shadow Education Institute in Korea, Hagwon instructors earned higher scores than school teachers in all surveyed areas, such as demonstrating teaching ability, scholarly enthusiasm, caring about students, providing individual guidance and counseling. Next slide, please. In the book, Kim provides ethnographic descriptions of K-12 students' educational lives, both in public schooling and shadow education. He also revealed how Korean students achieve higher grade and their academic goals using shadow education. Next slide, please. In 2019, we published Shadow Education as Worldwide Curriculum Studies. Ooh! This is the first book in our knowledge that discusses and theorizes shadow education from curriculum perspective. The key findings of the book include to discuss worldwide shadow education epidemic, as we have already discussed. Second, we theorized shadow curriculum as a new definition of curriculum. We also identified 5 forms of shadow education practices. Today, we would like to focus on introducing the definition of shadow curriculum and its characteristics. The reason we theorized shadow curriculum is that there were little research on shadow education in the field of curriculum studies. Given shadow education is about students learning, and given there are numerous curricular programs and teaching and learning materials provided by shadow education, given shadow education contributes to students' learning and achievement, which are all the research subject of curriculum studies. Shadow education needs to be studied from the perspectives of curriculum studies. Thus, we define the shadow curriculum as supplementary curriculum out of schooling provided by educational business industries that is intended to improve academic success of individual students in formal education. Next slide, please. These are the 4 characteristics of a shadow curriculum. First, the raison d'etre of shadow curriculum is students' academic success, while public education promotes mostly holistic development of students. Second, shadow curriculum is to meet individual students' academic needs and goals that are often not met in public schooling. Third, shadow curriculum is provided based on the amount of tuition, so it exacerbates the educational inequalities in the society. Fourth, in shadow curriculum, the competitive aspect of education and learning is heightened because students' achievement, exam scores, are the elements that shadow education allocate students into different level of courses. Next slide, please. For the sake of time, we are gonna skip some of the slides from this book, but we want to talk about the transboundary learning culture. For the advancement of international discourse of academic achievement, we theorized a new concept, transboundary learning culture, to study the characteristics of students learning in a changing environment. We utilize postmodern boundary crossing discourse. We use the boundary crossing that students experience in their everyday lives as they move back and forth between the two different educational spaces, public schooling and shadow education. Boundary crossing discourse helps to theorize the crossover between public schooling and shadow education, as there is no center. The modernist perspective conceives that public schooling is the center and shadow education is secondary or supplementary. We argue that the term shadow education places emphasis on a shadowy character and negatively frames shadow education as a subordinate or inferior to public education. By rejecting the rather fixed interpretation on shadow education, we try to theorize the ways in which students learn by moving forward and backward in the two different spaces and how they integrate them to achieve academic success. Specifically, we studied how do students integrate the two different kinds of learning to achieve their learning goals, emphasizing that East Asian students today do not solely rely on public schooling anymore. They actively use shadow education. We define the transboundary learning culture as students' attitude, strategies, and method to be used for their academic success over the boundary between public schooling and shadow education. Next slide, please. We identify the four kinds of transboundary learning culture. If we find some questions, we are going to talk more about this. Next slide, please. Before we invite the speakers from Hong Kong and Japan, I want to talk about another concept that we theorized in 2021 book. In 2021 book, we theorized students as nomad. Generally, nomadism refers to a way of life that exists outside of the sedentary or fixed order. Nomads regularly transgress and transform the sedentary rules of the state. They have these continuous identities and are able to make transitory connections. Deleuze and Guattari describe the nomadism as, quote, infinite openness, which circulates, accumulates, and affirms horizontal multiplicities and heterogeneities with the image of nomad who can connect to any other point in the open and smooth, borderless, rhizomatic space, close quote. In this way, the nomadic way of life is characterized by movement across space in sharp contrast to the rigid and static bound arises of the state. The concept of nomadism is helpful to frame the active learning culture that has emerged in East Asian countries. Nomadism involves elements of ongoingness, resistance, and connectivity, which many students are applying as they seek their own ideal learning method and curricula in shadow education space. The concept of students as nomad means that East Asian students actively, proactively, aggressively sometimes lead their learning. They are the central decision-making agent over the course of their learning and education. The concept of students as nomad rejects the Oriental representation about East Asian students as they have often been described as passive and obedient learners who simply follow what is provided by public school teachers. East Asian students now have nomadic thinking and their own decision-making strategies with regard to their learning.
Thank you, Jung-Hoon. The part 5 is the case studies in East Asian nations. In the book, there were 5 case studies from 5 nations: South Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore. Today, fortunately, we have 2 invited guest speakers from Japan and Hong Kong. So the Professor Ryo Michikura will talk about use of shadow education for their school success in Japan. And also Professor Kevin Wei-Ho Yang talk about Hong Kong experience about power and expansion of the shadow education for their school success in Hong Kong nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction of mine. And my name is Ryo Mizukura from Meiji University. I'm working as an senior assistant professor, and I contributed the edited book of Dr. Kim and Dr. Jun, and I'm going to talk about brief summary of our study in the chapter. Okay, next slide, please. In Japan, many researchers have attempted to uncover the nature of cram school education generally so far. However, regarding shadow education in particular forms and function, which were introduced by Dr. Jung and Dr. Kim, have not sufficiently been evaluated and also investigated until now. So particularly often see the census and a big survey conducted by mixed Ministry of Education in Japan about academic ability of students and their learning habit, and the other related influential factors tend to use mostly statistical data. So that's why maybe like if we want to know the more deeper knowledge and also descriptive data of shadow education, then we thought we need more qualitative descriptive data to explain it. So when we decided to contribute to the edited book of Dr. Kim and Dr. Jun, I and Love, the co-author of the chapter, agreed to conduct a qualitative data collection from 3 teachers in each level of schools, primary school and 3 junior high schools and also high schools. And also 3 students to they successfully went to the good universities. We interviewed them as well. And I can't explain everything that we mentioned in the chapter, but I will introduce some significant feature from our findings. In general, of course, cram schools are popular at all levels, but the functions was very different, slightly different from each other. For example, particularly in 6-year junior high school, that is combined together with the junior high school and also senior high school, and they study in one school. And the students would not take an entrance exam to go to the university level. So that's why they only mainly focus on the regular exam. And they don't study much about the question of the entrance exam. They really focus on just only the textbook content, and also they study about it. And also, we surprised at the qualitative data from one of the senior high school teacher. He is supporting students who are not very high level, and mainly they are going to the training college, seimongakko in Japanese. They need to take interview, or like they need to write about the purpose of state for studying at the school. So they need to prepare for well-written the statement of purpose, and also their interview, answering the question at the interview. So for that, they use the shadow education to support to go to these school levels. Yeah, they are not studying for the entrance exam, but additionally, they use a different function to support their learning in the schools. As a new trend, elementary school children started to study English as a compulsory subject. So that's why Eikaiwa school is also became popular among them. And primary school teachers told us, like most of them, because of the parents, they encourage them to go to the Eikaiwa school. And then And also they are worrying about the English education quality at the primary school. That is also very important for them to go to shadow education. Okay, then please go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so as a summary, students in all school levels and use clam school still, they tend to study basically Japanese and English and math for the entrance exams. But this is what we have seen from the previous studies and any other surveys in general. But we also could know the functions and the forms of shadow education is getting diverse depending on the context and also student level and the needs. In particular, teachers are very busy nowadays to support all the students in their school to support their academic success, and also because students are different from each other, so they need individual support sometimes. But the teachers are too busy to do many tasks in the Japanese education. That's why like shadow education can compensate this kind of lack of the approachability to each student. And also personally, I had thought clam school education was not positive when I was a student, like very long time ago. But now teacher, they became busier and busier, and they need more support, including shadow education in Japan. So shadow education must be a possible solution to keep a good education condition for Japanese students in many senses. Also, if we position ourselves in post-colonialism discourse to see the shadow education phenomena with our very good criticality, then shadow education is not need to be regarded as Oriental idea generally. Okay, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Liu. Next presenter is Professor Kevin Young. Please begin. Kevin, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much. Yeah, so thank you for the invitation. So this is what I'm going to talk about, basically talking about the education system in Hong Kong and the features of shadow education in Hong Kong. Next slide, please. So I think you're familiar with the definition of shadow education, okay, because in the presentation today, Dr. Jung and Dr. Kim has also, talked about, discussed the definition of shadow education in the literature. Well, in Hong Kong, okay, well, we are using Cantonese as a mother language, as a first language. We call shadow education 補習. Yeah. So this term literally means supplementary study, but basically it serves both function of remedy and also accelerated learning. So maybe in the past, more students who were weak academically joined private tutoring to remedy their learning at school. But now, okay, competition is so strong, so fierce in Hong Kong that a lot of elite students join private tutoring to secure their scores in public examinations or university admission. But then, okay, talking about the definition of 補習 in Hong Kong, indeed, it is expanding because we also call those fee-free supplementary tutoring and also those courses that may not necessarily shadow mainstream education as 補習. Yeah. So, this term in Hong Kong is kind of going beyond the traditional definition in the literature. Next slide, please. So talking about the Hong Kong educational context, like a lot of other Asian countries, it emphasizes a lot of academic performances. As you know, Hong Kong has been ranked very high in international standardized tests like PISA, TIMSS, and PIRLS. And people are kind of arguing that why Hong Kong or other Asian students who do so well in those international tests, maybe because they're so good at taking exams, And at the same time, a lot of students go for private tutoring to learn those exam skills. Same for students in Hong Kong. We think that they are pretty good at dealing with exams. So you can see, okay, at different levels, particularly in secondary school levels, private tutoring is very popular among students in Hong Kong. And in the school curriculum, all right, basically we have 12 years, 6-year primary and 6-year secondary. For kindergarten, it is not compulsory, but basically everyone goes for kindergarten before primary school. And along these 15 years of learning, shadow education, okay, has a role to play in all these stages. Next slide, please. So according to the study by Professor Mark Bray's team, so this work is basically led by Professor Mark Bray, okay, although the lead author is not Professor Mark Bray. Research has been focusing on Hong Kong and found that, okay, like almost a decade ago, that a lot of students in the secondary level already joined private tutoring. So you can see in the secondary school level, private tutoring, 補習, okay, it's very popular. And it has also been expanding at different levels, including preschoolers, kindergarten children, and primary school students. So there are many factors affecting the popularity of 補習. One of them is curriculum reform. In the past, in Hong Kong, we had 7 years of 7 years of secondary schooling and then 3 years of university. But since 2012, the education system has changed to 6 years of secondary school and 4 years of university. So because of the education reform, shadow education, including the subjects that are offered, have also changed. The other factor is the massification of post-secondary education. In the past, okay, not so many students were able to enter university. So some students who did not bother going into university may not even bother going for private tutoring. But now when the opportunities for going into higher education has increased, students feel that they may be able to get into university. And then this leads to more students joining private tutoring to get enough scores to get into university. Increase in academic and social competition, particularly after the handover, all right, of a sovereignty, okay, from Britain to China since the 1997. A lot of students from mainland China, okay, go to Hong Kong for their schooling. And also, competition has increased because of the limited space in higher education. Yeah, and also because of globalization, a lot of international students, okay, come to Hong Kong to take up those university places. So again, this increases the competition to get into higher education, leading to the popularity of 補習. Changes of language policy, okay, in the past, okay, the Chinese language is not, well, it was important, but it was not as important as after the handover, okay, when the sovereignty, okay, has been passed back to China, all right? So because of the increasing emphasis of learning Chinese language, shadow education for Chinese language has also become very popular. Adjusted regulations on shadow education. Yeah, I mean, compared to mainland China, maybe some of you have heard that the policy in mainland China has recently been very tight, okay, in terms of like controlling. Indeed, they are banning private tutoring in mainland China, okay, in these few months. In Hong Kong, the regulation is not very tight. The main regulation is just about the control of the classroom as long as it is following the fire ordinance. Like, you know, it is the safety issues per se, not really, you know, a lot of regulations. So other features and practices of 補習, okay, for different stages, shadow education or 補習, okay, may be popular in different forms. For example, for preschoolers and kindergarten children, there are a lot of we call play groups, a group of children, the kids, go to a classroom and then like speak English or Mandarin or learn social skills, okay, with the tutors. And primary school admission interviews as well, okay, are also popular among younger children. For primary school pupils, okay, the kind of private tutoring is usually home-based, mainly for homework guidance. And some also subscribe to learning programs like Cambridge English Starters so that they can get enough certificates to prepare for secondary school admission. For secondary students, okay, cram schools, are very popular in Hong Kong, okay, particularly those tutors who are marketized as stars and celebrities. And also video recorded and online tutoring are also popular among secondary school students. Next slide, please. So overall, BOZAP, okay, is definitely widespread for students at all ages in Hong Kong, and they are popular for different various modes. And then it also, okay, it's about how BOZAP is marketed. As I said, okay, BOZAP is so widely advertised, and a lot of tutors are marketized as celebrities. And then we also may want to, in terms of research, explore the relationship between BOZAP and mainstream schooling. And also the development of BOZAP in the future. Yeah, particularly the rise of online tutoring. We think that this is also happening in Hong Kong and also Asia and even around the world. And these aspects are really worth exploring in research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. Your presentation was great and energetic. Next session is the part 6, which is called Future Studies and Issues. However, the purpose of this part 6 is ask the audience to participate in further inquiries. So before moving to that session, is there something that Professor Keita Takayama wants to talk about this session?
Thank you very much. So let me just thank you for the very comprehensive presentation that you guys put together. I'm really, really appreciative of what you've done today, because it was a really solid introduction to the topic on shadow education. But also there is a considerable work that you guys done in the last 5 years or so around reconceptualization of the phenomena shadow education, and you guys are really leading the discussion from East Asia. So it was a wonderful presentation. Thanks very much. Thank you for all your hard work. And also I want to thank Rio and Kevin for chiming in to present your case studies. So thank you. Okay, so but I know that people need some time to think about their questions. Now, as I said, I have a lot of questions to ask. So I might, if you don't mind, I'm going to start off with a few questions, and after that, people can join in, ask questions. Okay. So thanks again. Wonderful. I really enjoyed it. So what's interesting to me is that your notion, you're trying to really redefine the notion of shadow education, how that has been studied and discussed, primarily in the English scholarship. And then your observation is that shadow education has been conceptualized as a problem, as something undesirable. So the implicit assumption here is that it is something that needs to be eventually eliminated or get rid of, right? And also it is a shadow as opposed to light. So it is something that is a bit questionable. We don't know what's going on. But the assumption is that, of course, formal education is the legitimate form of education, and shadow education is less legitimate, or perhaps unwanted or evil, as you said, form of education. So you're trying to turn that assumption around by saying that, look, shadow education is actually a central and constitutive part of education culture in East Asia, right? So in saying that, you are actually challenging the deficit characterization of East Asia and East Asian education as a whole. So that's where your post-colonial, post-Orientalist perspective comes in. So I can see how two bodies of literature, right? One about shadow education, one more conceptual work around post-colonial literature, how those two literature merge together in your work. So that's interesting. The question to me is that I guess there are some claims made in your presentation that were quite contested, to say the least. One of the claims that you made in your presentation is that shadow education needs to be considered when we try to understand East Asian academic success, most clearly represented in the PISA success, right? So in other words, shadow education is actually a central part of, in terms of explaining why East Asian kids are doing so well on international testing and so forth. As soon as I heard that, I thought about this book. I'm sure you're familiar with this book. It's a book by Hyunjun Park, Korean academic based in the United States, Pennsylvania University. He's a sociologist of education who published a book called Re-Evaluating Education in Japan and Korea, and Demystifying Stereotypes. So just like you guys, Hyunjun Park was really trying to challenge the prevailing negative representation of Japanese and Korean education in English scholarship, particularly the negativity around standardized system of education. So he claims that standardized education is actually so central to the quality and egalitarian nature of Japanese and Korean education, right? But in this book, he has a chapter on I think it was chapter 5, demystifying the stereotype, and then are high test scores of Japanese and Korean students due to shadow education, right? Are Korean and Japanese kids performing well because of shadow education? So Hyunjun Park undertakes a secondary analysis of the PISA data set to conclude that basically shadow education has very little impact on students' performance. Having said that, he also acknowledged the empirical evidence on the effect of shadow education on students' performance is very much mixed and also confusing, right? So I wondered, how would you respond to that particular claim that the Hyunjun Park makes in this book? Let's just start with that.
Thank you for the Professor Keita Takayama's question about possible negative impact of the shadow education in Japan and the South Korean students.
Sorry, it's not a negative impact.
Oh, yeah.
It's
okay.
just that there's no, he's contesting the claim that the shadow education actually contributes to the academic success of Japanese and Korean students, right? So he's actually, challenging the empirical basis of your argument to a certain extent.
And I have never met Professor Hyunjun Park and Suyong Byun at the University of Pennsylvania and Penn State University, and those two Korean native international scholar in working for the sociology of education and comparative education did write the wonderful statistical research on the relationship between shadow education and academic success. And part of the literature was correct from what I read. But please think about emic and ethic perspective. they have never used the live and ethnographic and qualitative research about Korean students' use of shadow education in their lives. They only cited statistics South Korea data for the analyzing PISA test. It is kind of insightful, but I couldn't agree with those conclusion because there are many kinds of the correlational and statistical research between two variables. So there are kind of pro and cons literature about positive and negative effect of the shadow education. From the perspective, I think that we need to collect and produce more balanced quantitative and qualitative research. That's what I'm trying to point out as the first problem, because that we need to do more empirical and qualitative research, and they have never been in the field work in Korean society. They just cited, statistics and numbers. And second one, whether the shadow education is correlated to the student academic success in public schooling or not. Shadow education space should be considered as the emerging center space of educational development. Think about the church, think about the library, think about the garden. When you go or when you visit that place, you don't think about effect. Did I pray 75% effect? We do not think. When you go to the church, you are satisfied when you pray. When you go to the library, you feel something which you couldn't feel from the classroom. That's what I'm trying to reorganize or re-territorize the meaning of the shadow education. Sometimes the students are really tired at reading Korean textbook at 9 o'clock in the morning. But sometimes students are really happy about their new learning, even though their body is really tired. So what I'm trying to re-territorize the meaning of the shadow education, which has been determined and characterized by the Western scholar, that is the something essential part of the educational life. Now the two schools, public schooling during the day and shadow education at night, in the place they don't simply teach how to solve the English problem, math problem. That is the learning place. You meet another private tutor with the different knowledge, different learning experience, different worldview about what is the education, what is the good choice for their lives. So thus this is kind of your personal problems, school problems, family problems, my personal psychological, mental problems, learning problems, those problems which couldn't be solved by the school teachers, your problems can be cured. So now we need to move from the previous discourse of the Western discourse on do the shadow education, Korean schooling, improve the students' English score 2 point, school mathematics 3 point higher. That is the part of the quantitative approach problems and limitations. That is the new space for Korean or East Asian student whole mental, physical, and social development. That's what I'm trying to say. When you go to the apartment, you cannot find any Korean student during a day on the playground or on the street during a day. If you need to practice, improve your friendship skill, you need to go to the hagwon at night. So sometimes, when you go to hagwon, you meet the new friends, you meet the new different teacher with the different ideas and different definition and different technique to solve the mathematical problems. I think this is the advantage for the student in East Asia. So I think that to do something quantitative research on the use, on the impact of the shadow education student academic success in the area of Korean language or English language, mathematics and science area is the one part. But there's a very strict definition of the shadow education. I think the shadow education space should be reinterpreted as the emerging development space for students' whole life and their academic success until their entrance to the college. I'm not sure whether my answer has been responding to the Professor Keita Takayama's question.
No, I think we're on the same page. I think I totally agree what you're saying. The one point I know some of the people wanted to jump in, so I'm going to make a very quick response to that comment. But basically, I think you do not need to rely upon this argument about the effectiveness of a shadow education for educational outcome, because you do that, right? You do rely to a certain extent in your argument on the contested empirical basis about the effectiveness of shadow education for educational outcome. And I just don't think you need to rely on that argument at all, because you have a beautiful narrative to make. That is the argument that is a rich educational culture and even theory of learning that is very specific in shadow education, right? So to highlight that, you don't need to rely upon this argument about the effectiveness of shadow education for educational outcome. So that's the point I wanted to make, right? So, but the gist of the point that you're making, I agree, okay? Anyway, with that note, I would like to conclude this session. Thanks very much for the presenters today, Chun Kim and Jung-Hoon Jung, for the wonderful, very, very comprehensive presentation. Thanks a lot for you guys. So I will see you next time. We have another presentation or talk scheduled toward the end of or mid-December, I think, by someone from Singapore. Please look forward to it. Thanks very much. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.